The wind screamed through Cannon Pass like a living thing with teeth, and Belle Collins stood at the edge of the cliff road with nowhere left to run. Behind her, the hoofbeats of 3 riders thundered closer through the mountain darkness, their torches cutting orange slashes against the black pine tree line. Ahead, the narrow switchback path dropped into a ravine so deep that the bottom was pure shadow, invisible, unknowable. Her horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles back and gone lame on the rocky grade. She had been running on foot for what felt like an eternity, her boots splitting at the sole, her breath tearing through her chest in ragged, burning strips. The small leather satchel clutched against her ribs held everything she had left in this world: the deed to her father's land, a single photograph, and a letter so dangerous that men had already died because of it. She spun around. The torches were rounding the last bend. She could hear one of the riders laugh, that slow, satisfied sound a wolf makes when the chase is almost over. She pressed her back against the canyon wall and closed her eyes. This was the trap. She had known it for 2 days, ever since she'd found the forged signature on the land transfer document hidden in Wade Coulter's office desk. She had been set up the moment she'd walked into Reed Rock, set up before she'd even arrived, maybe. The betrayal went deeper than she had imagined, all the way down to the people she had trusted most, and now it was going to cost her everything. The lead rider crested the bend and his torch swept the path. He saw her immediately. There she is, cornered like a rabbit. His voice was flat and professional, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Professional men were harder to bargain with. And then from above her, from some impossible upper ledge she had not even noticed in the dark, a voice came down like a stone dropped from a great height. "I would not take another step if I were you." She looked up. A man on a massive gray horse sat motionless on the ledge above the path, his silhouette cut sharp against a sky full of cold stars. The silver star on his chest caught the torchlight and threw it back. His rifle rested across the saddle horn with an ease that communicated absolute certainty. He did not look afraid. He did not look uncertain. He looked like a man who had already decided exactly how this was going to end. The lead rider pulled up his horse. "Marshal, you got no jurisdiction up here. This is county land." "My jurisdiction is wherever a woman is being run down a mountain in the dark," the man on the ledge said. "Try me on it." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with wind and the nervous stamping of horses. Then the man on the ledge turned his gaze down to Belle, and even from that distance, even in the dark, she felt the weight of his attention like a hand on her shoulder. "Get on my horse," he said. "We will figure out the rest later." She had never in her life taken an order from a stranger without question. She was not built that way. Her father had raised her with a stubborn spine and a skeptical mind, and she had survived 26 years in the territory by trusting her own judgment above anyone else's. But something in his voice, some bedrock quality of absolute steadiness, reached down through all of her fear and exhaustion and grabbed her by the core. She grabbed the rope he tossed down without a second thought, and she climbed. 3 weeks earlier, Belle Collins had stepped off the stage in Reed Rock, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882 with a carpetbag, a sharp tongue, and a plan she had spent the better part of 4 months constructing. Her father, Thomas Collins, had died in February. The official verdict was heart failure. Belle knew better. Thomas Collins had been healthy as an ox at 61, and he had written her a letter 2 weeks before his death, a letter that had arrived just after the telegram informing her of his passing, the timing of it leaving her breathless with dread. In that letter, her father described a man named Wade Coulter, a land agent newly arrived in the Reed Rock area with money, charm, and an appetite for acquiring homestead properties at fractions of their value. Thomas Collins had been resisting Coulter's pressure to sell for 6 months. He had told Belle in that letter that he suspected Coulter had connections to the county recorder's office, and that he feared something was being arranged against him without his knowledge. 2 weeks later, he was dead, and the county recorder's office sent Belle a notice informing her that the deed to the Collins homestead had been transferred to the Coulter Land and Development Company of Santa Fe. Belle had spent 4 months in Albuquerque building her legal case, working with a printer's clerk who owed her a favor to copy documents, and tracking down 2 former neighbors of her father who were willing to sign sworn statements. She arrived in Redrock with those statements, and a plan to walk into the county courthouse and challenge the transfer on grounds of fraud. What she had not planned for was how completely Coulter had already sewn up the town. The county recorder, a man named Billings, was visibly nervous when she arrived, looked at her documents, and told her she would need to come back in a week when the clerk returned from Santa Fe. The hotel owner, a small, sweating man named Pryor, gave her a room on the ground floor and then seemed to immediately regret it. The man at the general store refused to sell her more than 1 day's worth of supplies at a time. By the end of her first day in Redrock, Belle had the distinct and deeply uncomfortable sensation of being watched from every angle, assessed like a chess piece that needed to be moved off the board. She had not yet heard of Marshal Jonas Walden at that point. She had not needed to. She was still, at that moment, entirely confident in her own plan. The second morning, she rose before dawn and walked to the courthouse herself, intending to search the records room before business hours, which was technically not permitted, but also technically not illegal since the building was never properly locked. She found the records room, found the land transfer document, found what she was looking for in about 12 minutes of focused searching, and then she found Wade Coulter's private office on the second floor unlocked and too interesting to pass by. The forged signature she discovered in his desk drawer changed everything. It was not just her father's signature that had been forged on the land transfer. The same hand had signed 4 other names on 4 other transfers: the Brennan farm, the Acker property, the Old Mission parcel, and a 50-acre water rights document that was worth more than everything else combined because it controlled the only reliable creek in the valley. These were not small thefts. This was a systematic land grab, methodical and patient, the kind that required official cooperation, legal patience, and the occasional removal of obstacles. The kind that required men to die of sudden heart failure. She took the document. She should not have. It was the decision that turned the entire situation from a legal challenge into a foot race, because by the time the courthouse opened at 9 that morning, someone had noticed the disturbance in Coulter's office, and by noon, the 3 riders had already started tracking her east toward the mountains. She had made it as far as Cannon Pass before her horse gave out. Now she sat behind a man whose name she did not yet know on a gray horse so large, it seemed to move the mountain road aside simply by existing on it. And they rode through the dark in silence, while the 3 men below them remained very still on their side of the ledge path, apparently having decided that arguing with a man holding a rifle who also held the high ground was not in their immediate interest. The man called back to the riders in a voice that carried absolutely no heat, which made it more frightening than shouting would have been. "Tell Coulter I have the woman. Tell him I have what she was carrying. Tell him that if anything happens to either one by morning, the United States Marshal's office in Santa Fe will have an envelope that makes for very interesting reading. You understand me?" No answer from below, but Belle heard the horses turn and start back down the mountain. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The man urged his horse forward on the upper trail. He said nothing for a long while. She sat behind him with her arms around his waist because the trail was too narrow and too dark to do otherwise, and she was aware, through the fog of her exhaustion and fear, of how solid he was, like a wall that had decided to become a person. Broad-shouldered, straight-backed, not tense exactly but contained, like something with considerable force kept carefully inside a deliberate stillness. "Are you hurt?" he said finally. "No, your boots are split." "I am aware of my boots." A pause. "Can you ride through the night?" "I can do what I need to do." Another pause, longer this time. "That satchel you are holding, what is in it?" "Documents. Important ones. Important enough that 3 men chased me up a mountain." He nodded once, as if this confirmed a calculation he had already made. "My name is Jonas Walden. I am a United States Deputy Marshal out of Santa Fe. I have been in this county for 11 days looking into land fraud." She felt something unlock in her chest, some small piece of held tension releasing. "Belle Collins, my father owned the Collins homestead, present tense because I intend to get it back." "Thomas Collins," Jonas said. "It was not a question. You know him." "I know of him. His name is in my files." "He is dead," Belle said, and the words still scraped coming out 3 months later every single time. February. The official verdict was heart failure. Jonas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted by some degree that she could not quite name. Not softer exactly, more careful. "I am sorry for your loss." "Are you actually, or is that something you say?" A longer pause. "Both," he said. "I say it, I also mean it." She found she believed him, which surprised her enough to keep her quiet for a while. They rode through the mountains for the better part of 3 hours, following a trail that Jonas clearly knew from memory, winding down through the pine-heavy slopes and out onto the flat mesa country below, where the stars were enormous and the dry wind smelled of sage and cold rock. He had a camp established in a dry wash 5 miles from the base of the pass, a lean-to, a fire pit, a second horse picketed to a juniper tree. It was a practical, spare, well-organized camp, the camp of a man who had been living outdoors for a long time and had stopped resenting it. He helped her down from the horse with one hand, not effusively, just efficiently, and tied the gray horse next to the second one. He rebuilt the fire from the banked coals with an economy of motion that Belle found both impressive and slightly annoying, because she was cold and she had been trying not to show it, and he had a fire going in about 90 seconds without making any particular effort. "Sit," he said. "I am sitting," she said, already sitting. He handed her a tin cup of water from a canteen, then began heating something in a small pot, what turned out to be dried bean soup with some salted pork, bland and slightly oversalted and entirely wonderful. She ate 2 bowls before she remembered that she was theoretically in control of herself. She looked at him over the fire. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his mid-30s with dark hair gone silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something dense, and eyes that were a color she could not quite pin down in the firelight, somewhere between gray and dark green, watchful without being cold. He had a scar along his left jaw, old and well-healed. His hands were large and competent and calloused, and he held the coffee cup the same way he held the rifle, like he had held a lot of things for a long time and no longer needed to think about it. He was, Belle thought with some irritation, quite remarkably handsome in a way that she might have noticed more readily if she were not in the middle of a crisis, which was probably just as well. "Tell me about the documents," he said. She told him. She laid out everything, the forged signatures, the 4 other properties, the water rights document, the county recorder's apparent cooperation, her father's letter, the systematic nature of the whole operation. She was a clear and organized speaker. She had always been, and she watched his expression as she talked. He listened the way professionals listen, without interrupting, without reacting emotionally, tracking the information and filing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "The water rights document," he said. 50 acres on Seco Creek. "Yes. That is the one that matters most to Coulter. That is the one he needs to hold onto to make the rest of the operation pay. The other land is valuable, but that water access is what makes the whole valley worth developing. Without it, the homesteads he has accumulated are just dry acreage." He looked at her. "You took the original. I took it. I should not have." "No," he agreed without judgment. "But it means he cannot simply file a replacement because the original is missing and presumably in unfriendly hands, which makes the whole transfer questionable." He was quiet again. "He will want it back, badly. Hence the 3 men," Belle said. "Hence the 3 men." He reached across and refilled her coffee cup without asking, which was presumptuous, but her cup was empty and she was cold, so she let it pass. You mentioned a letter from your father. She pulled it from the satchel and handed it to him. He read it slowly twice by firelight, then folded it and handed it back. This is evidence of motive, he said. Combined with the forged signature and the timeline of the transfer, it builds a reasonable fraud case. But you need the county recorder to flip on Coulter, or you need a federal judge willing to hear it without going through the county circuit court. Which one is more likely? The recorder, Jonas said. I have been working on him for 8 days. He is scared. He did not understand what he was getting into when he agreed to cooperate with Coulter, and he is now in considerably deeper than he is comfortable with. He paused. Your arrival may have accelerated his willingness to talk. How? Because you have the original document. Which means the transfer is now legally questionable regardless of what the recorder says. Which means Coulter's whole arrangement is wobbling and the recorder can see that clearly. He looked at her steadily. You disrupted his plans. That was either the best thing you could have done, or it puts you in considerably more danger than you were already in. You make it sound like both. Because it is both. She looked at him for a long moment across the fire. You came up to that pass tonight knowing those men would be there. He did not deny it. I had been following them for 2 hours. I knew they were after someone. I did not know it was you specifically until I got close enough to see. What would you have done if it had not been me? If it had just been some random person being chased? The same answer would apply, he said. She studied him. You are either very principled or very reckless. People keep telling me it is one or the other, he said, and she thought, but could not be certain, that there was the very faint shadow of something like amusement in his expression. Get some sleep, he said. I will take first watch. We move before dawn. She wrapped herself in the spare blanket he provided and lay down on the opposite side of the fire, and she thought she would not be able to sleep, because she was in an unknown camp with a man she had met 2 hours ago, and 3 hired riders were somewhere in the mountains behind her. But exhaustion had a logic of its own, and she was asleep in less than 10 minutes. Jonas Walden watched her sleep for longer than was strictly necessary for professional reasons. He told himself he was watching the perimeter. He was partly, but he was also sitting with the particular quality of attention she created in him, which he did not have a ready name for, and which he found unsettling in the specific way that things were unsettling when they were real. He had been a United States Deputy Marshal for 9 years. Before that, 2 years as a county sheriff in eastern Colorado. Before that, 4 years as a cavalry sergeant in the Indian Wars, service he was not proud of and did not discuss, service that had left him with a scar on his jaw, a recurring dream he also did not discuss, and a deep and specific exhaustion with violence that did not prevent him from using it when necessary, but had permanently altered his relationship with the profession of force. He had been through the fire that removes the ornamental from a person, and what remained was mostly patience, mostly competence, and a quietness that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for coldness. He was 35 years old. He had been alone for the better part of 8 years, by which he meant genuinely alone, not just unmarried, but operating in the specific isolation of a man whose work requires him to pass through places rather than stay in them. He had not expected Belle Collins. He had not expected, specifically, the quality of her mind, which she had displayed in the 20 minutes of explanation she had given him, organized and precise and not wasting a single word. But underneath it something fierce and personal, grief mixed with determination in a way that was both compelling and a little heartbreaking. He had not expected the stubborn set of her jaw or the way she had grabbed his rope and climbed without hesitation while 3 armed men watched from below. He had not expected the sharpness of her wit or the way she held exhaustion at bay through sheer will, and he had certainly not expected the fact that, when she was asleep, with all of that controlled energy released, she looked younger and more vulnerable and considerably more beautiful than she had already looked, which had already been considerable. He looked away, back toward the dark trail. He was here to do a job. He would do the job. He would help her recover her land, build his case against Coulter, and move on to the next assignment. That was what he did. He told himself this in a way that suggested he already suspected it was not going to be quite that straightforward. Before first light, he woke her with a hand on her shoulder and said simply, "Time." She was on her feet in about 4 seconds, which told him she had been a light sleeper her whole life, or had become one in recent months, which amounted to the same thing in practice. They broke camp in silence and rode east while the sky was still black, and by the time the sun came up orange over the mesa, they were an hour away from Red Rock on the back approach, coming in through the dry arroyo that ran behind the livery stable, avoiding the main road. Jonas had a clear plan. He needed to get to the county recorder before Coulter's men returned and reported what had happened at the pass. The recorder, Billings, was a man who went to church every Sunday and spent Monday feeling guilty about his week, which Jonas had learned in his first 3 days in town and had been carefully filing away as useful. Guilt was a lever. You could use guilt the way a good engineer used a fulcrum, positioned correctly. It could move something far heavier than raw force alone could manage. He wanted Belle somewhere safe while he handled Billings. She wanted to come with him. They had their first real argument about it in the livery stable, conducted in low voices under the curious ear of a stable hand who was pretending very convincingly to be asleep in the hay. "I have been working this case for 11 days, Jonas said, keeping his voice level. "I know this man. I know how he thinks. You walking in there with me is a variable that changes the dynamic in ways I cannot control." "I have the documents," Belle said, equally level, equally firm. "You need the documents to show him what you have. He is more likely to cooperate if he sees the full picture of what I recovered from Coulter's office. I can describe them. Showing is different from describing." He looked at her. "You are not wrong about that. I know I am not. It is also true that Coulter's men may have come back through town and he may know you are here, in which case you are not safe walking into a public building." "I am not safe anywhere Coulter can reach," she said. "At least if I am with you, there is a man with a federal star who has a reason to prevent anyone from doing anything unfortunate to me." He could not argue with this because it was also true. "Fine," he said. "You stay behind me. If I tell you to go, you go. If I tell you to be quiet, you are quiet." "If your reading of the situation is correct," she said, "my reading will be correct." "If," she said, and looked at him with something that was almost a smile, and was somehow more unsettling than a smile would have been. They went to see Edmund Billings at his home before the courthouse opened, which was deliberate. Men were easier to reach when they were still in the private space of their domestic life, before they had put on their official face. Billings answered the door in his shirt sleeves, holding a coffee cup, and the color drained out of his face when he saw Jonas. When he saw Belle standing behind him, the color that had drained came back as a deep, hectic red. "Marshal," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Billings," Jonas said. "May we come in?" They came in. Billings's wife appeared at the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation with a glance, and disappeared without a word in the way of women who have learned to read when to leave a room. Billings sat at his kitchen table like a man waiting for a sentence to be read. Jonas laid out the case methodically, clearly, without drama. He described what Belle had found, described his own 11 days of investigation, described the legal weight of what they had collectively assembled. He watched Billings's face as he spoke. He watched the calculations happening there, the fear, the guilt, the desperate arithmetic of a man trying to determine which choice was less terrible. Belle placed the forged document on the table between them without speaking. Billings looked at it for a long time. His hand was shaking slightly. "I did not know about Collins," he said, finally. Was not looking at Belle. "I did not know anyone was going to get hurt. He told me it was all legitimate, just a recording issue, a technical matter of paperwork." He stopped. "I know that is not an excuse." Belle was very still across the table. Jonas watched her hold herself together through what had to be considerable effort because the man sitting across from her had signed the paperwork that had made her father's death profitable for someone else, and she knew it. "No," she said quietly. "It is not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and there is a difference, and right now I need the difference more than I need the blame." Billings looked at her for the first time directly. Something in him seemed to physically diminish, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has just been told he can put it down. "What do you need from me?" he said. Jonas told him. He needed a sworn affidavit describing the full extent of Coulter's requests and the circumstances under which Billings had cooperated. He needed the original recording ledger with the relevant entries. He needed Billings to be available to testify before a federal judge in Santa Fe, and he needed all of this to happen before Coulter became aware of the meeting. "If you do this," Jonas said, "the United States Marshal's office will make a formal recommendation to the federal district attorney that your cooperation be taken into account. I cannot make you a promise about the outcome, but I can tell you that cooperation at this stage, before a prosecution has been formally initiated, is worth considerably more than cooperation after." Billings nodded slowly, repeatedly, like a man agreeing with his own conscience rather than with the marshal. "I will do it," he said. They spent the next 2 hours at Billings's kitchen table, Belle writing while Jonas dictated the structure of the affidavit and Billings filled in the details. His wife brought them coffee twice without being asked, and the second time she set down the coffee, she put her hand briefly on Billings's shoulder and looked at him with an expression that contained forgiveness and exhaustion and love in about equal measure. And Jonas noticed that Belle's pen paused for a moment before she continued writing. They left with the affidavit signed and the ledger under Jonas's arm, and walked back through the quiet morning streets of Redrock toward the livery stable. "That was well handled," Belle said after a block of silence. "Which part?" "All of it, but specifically what you said about the difference between an excuse and an explanation." "That was not your line." "No," he said, "it was yours. You used it on purpose. It was true, and it was what he needed to hear." He glanced at her. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said after a moment, "it is not." They were nearly back to the livery when two things happened at almost the same moment. First, Jonas's instincts, which had kept him alive for 17 years in dangerous country, registered something wrong about the street ahead, a too empty quality, a specific absence of the ambient human noise that a town's main street should have at 7 in the morning. Second, a voice called out from the alley between the general store and the hardware shop. "Marshal Walden." The voice belonged to Wade Coulter. He was not hiding, which was part of what made the situation immediately dangerous. He stood in the alley's mouth with the easy confidence of a man who believed he held all the relevant cards, and he was well-dressed and well-fed, and had the wide, comfortable face of someone who had never personally done any of the things he had arranged for others to do. He was maybe 45, with a gray mustache and hands that were too smooth for any kind of honest Western labor. Beside him stood 2 of the 3 riders from the pass, and Belle recognized them by their horses, if not by their faces in the morning light. "I hear you had quite a night," Coulter said, pleasantly addressing Jonas, "and I hear you have been having quite a productive morning as well." Jonas stopped walking. He stepped slightly to the right, which put himself between Belle and the alley mouth, a movement so natural it barely looked like a movement at all. "Morning, Mr. Coulter," he said. "I think we can resolve this like reasonable men," Coulter said. "The woman has a document that does not belong to her. I think if she returns it, and if we all agree that certain misunderstandings have occurred, there is no reason why the county recorder needs to be further distressed, and no reason why anyone needs to go to Santa Fe." "Is that what you think?" Jonas said. "I think we are all practical people." "I think you are about to find out what practical people actually looks like," Jonas said, and his voice had that specific quality it had had at the pass, not louder, not angrier, just harder, like a door closing on something. He reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope, which he held up so Coulter could see the official U.S. Marshal's seal on the back. "This is a federal arrest warrant for you personally, Mr. Coulter, sworn before a federal magistrate in Santa Fe 3 days ago on the basis of my preliminary findings. The warrant covers land fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and filing false government documents. I have been waiting until I had enough to charge you on every count before I served it." He paused. "You have sufficiently helped me with the timing." Coulter's pleasant expression did not change exactly, but something behind it recalculated at considerable speed. "You cannot have enough for a warrant. I do have enough. I also now have considerably more, including the sworn testimony of the county recorder of this district, obtained this morning, and the original land transfer document for the Seco Creek water rights, which is currently in Miss Collins's bag." Jonas took a step toward him. "Your men can reach for their guns if they would like to, but I would point out that would change this from a civil proceeding into a federal assault on a United States Marshal, which carries mandatory consequences that no amount of county connections can address." The two riders looked at each other. They looked at their employer. Whatever they were being paid, it was not enough for a federal offense, and their faces made this clear. Coulter raised his smooth hand slightly. "This is not over." "It is sufficiently over for today," Jonas said. "Turn around, Mr. Coulter, slowly." He arrested Wade Coulter on the main street of Red Rock, New Mexico Territory, in the morning light, with 3 witnesses watching from various windows along the street who had apparently found practical reasons to be near their windows at that specific hour. He bound Coulter's wrists with iron handcuffs that he carried in his saddlebag and escorted him to the small jail at the edge of town, where the deputy, a nervous young man named Fitch, looked at the situation with considerable alarm. "Wire Santa Fe," Jonas told Fitch. "Tell them I need a transport to bring a federal prisoner in by end of week. Use the Marshal's office cipher." Belle stood outside the jail door in the morning sun and felt something very large and very heavy begin, slowly and imperfectly, to release. It was not finished. She knew it was not finished. There was still the question of the land title, still the long, procedural work of a federal fraud case, still the very real possibility that Coulter had other allies in other offices who might slow or complicate the recovery of her father's property. Legal battles in the territory in 1882 were not quick victories even when you were clearly in the right. She knew all of this, but Coulter was in handcuffs. The recorder had given testimony. The original documents were safe. For the first time in 3 months, the board was arranged in her favor, at least temporarily, and she was standing in the sun with both feet on the ground, and she was not running. Jonas came out of the jail door and stood beside her, not too close, not too far, looking down the street. "What happens next?" she said. "I ride to Santa Fe with the prisoner and the evidence. Fitch can manage him for a few days until transport arrives." He paused. "You should come to Santa Fe to give your testimony before the federal magistrate while the case is being filed. Billings's affidavit is strong, but your account of what you found in Coulter's office and the documentation you recovered significantly strengthens the charging document." He looked at her directly. "It also gets you out of Red Rock before Coulter's associates have time to reconsider their options. You are saying I am still not safe here. Not until the case is formally filed and the federal charges are active. Once that happens, any interference with you becomes obstruction of federal proceedings, which is a different kind of deterrent." He held her gaze. "I am not going to tell you what to do, but if you are asking my judgment, I think you should come." She looked at him for a moment, aware of the distance between them, aware of the morning sun on the street, aware of the faint, insistent reality that this man had ridden into a pass in the dark and held off 3 armed men because a woman he had never met was cornered against a cliff wall, and had done it without drama, without calculation, without expecting anything from it. "I will need to stop at the hotel for my bag," she said. "I will wait," he said. The ride to Santa Fe took 4 days. Coulter traveled in wrist irons under Jonas's watch, and they stopped each night at one of the small relay stations along the military road, where Jonas arranged separate sleeping quarters with the particular practical concern that Belle was beginning to understand was simply how he operated, not chivalry as performance, but as habit, a baseline standard of decency that he applied to every situation without needing to be asked. On the first night she could not sleep and sat outside on the relay station's porch steps in the cool dark, and Jonas came out after a while with 2 cups of coffee and sat 2 steps below her, which put them at approximately the same height, and they talked. Not about the case, about other things. She told him about her father, not the circumstances of his death, but the man himself, his particular combination of stubbornness and warmth, his habit of quoting scripture when he was uncomfortable, his extraordinary patience with horses and complete lack of patience with paperwork. She found herself talking about him in a way she had not been able to with anyone since his death, not with careful distance or through tears, but with the kind of full-hearted honesty that is only possible when you feel, somehow, that the person listening will hold it correctly. Jonas listened. When she paused, he said, "He sounds like a man who knew what mattered." "He did," she said. "He was better at it than I am." "Why do you say that?" She thought about it. "He was not afraid of softness. I think I have been afraid of it, particularly this year. I have been so focused on the fight that I have not really—" She stopped. "This is not something I usually say aloud." "I know," Jonas said quietly. "It is harder to say than the rest of it." She looked at him. "Do you ever talk about your own life?" A pause. "Not as a habit." "I am not asking you to do something you do not want to do." "I know." He looked at the dark land beyond the station yard. "I was married," he said, "for 2 years. Her name was Ruth. She died in the winter of 1874, fever. I was on assignment in Colorado when it happened." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not get there in time. The night was very still around them." "I am sorry," Belle said, and she meant it the way he had meant it at the pass, both as a thing she said and as a genuine thing she felt. "I have been doing this work since then," he said, "moving place to place. It suited me." He paused. "I think I used it to avoid things I was not ready to face." "What kind of things?" He turned and looked at her, and in the lamplight from the station doorway, his expression had lost some of its careful containment, and what she saw underneath was not what she had expected. Not hardness, not damage exactly. Something more like a long-held question, waiting for circumstances it could finally trust. "The kind of things," he said, "that you need to stay in one place long enough to want." She felt the weight of that settle around them in the night air, not uncomfortably, like the warmth of a fire reaching a particular distance, just far enough. Neither of them said anything more for a while, and the silence was the kind that meant something rather than nothing. On the second day of riding, Coulter attempted to be charming with Belle when Jonas rode ahead briefly to scout a water crossing, speaking to her from the back of the horse that Fitch's deputy had lent for the transport, bound hands resting on the saddle horn, his smooth face arranged in an expression of practiced reasonableness. "Miss Collins," he said, "I want you to know I had no personal animosity toward your father. Business in this territory requires difficult decisions sometimes." "My father is dead," Belle said, looking straight ahead. "I am not interested in your framing of that. I am simply saying that a reasonable settlement financially might serve everyone better than a long legal process." "You are offering me money," she said. "I am suggesting that practical arrangements—" "My father worked that land for 30 years, Belle said, still looking at the trail ahead. "He built every building on it by hand. He planted every tree in the yard. He is buried in the northeast corner of it, under a cottonwood he planted himself 20 years ago." She turned and looked at Coulter with a directness that made him blink. "There is no money you could offer me that would be worth discussing, not because I am sentimental. Because you are a man who arranges for people to die when they become inconvenient, and any agreement I made with you would be worth exactly as much as my father's deed was worth under your hand." Coulter had no answer for this. He looked away. When Jonas returned from scouting the crossing and looked between them with the professional attention he applied to changes in the atmosphere, Coulter said nothing about what had been discussed, and neither did Belle, and they crossed the water in silence. That evening, Jonas walked his horse beside hers for a stretch of flat land as the sun dropped behind the Jemez Mountains, and the sky went extraordinary colors. "He tried to buy you off," Jonas said. "It was not a question." "Yes, and you declined in terms he will remember. I may have been somewhat direct." "Good," Jonas said. She looked at him. "You are not going to tell me to be careful around him. He is in chains and I am armed. Careful around him is my job." He paused. "Being exactly who you are is yours." She felt that land somewhere specific. On the third night, when the relay station was crowded and the only private space available was a narrow porch, they stood closer together than they had before, necessarily, and then by choice. She was aware of the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence beside her, the way his arm touched hers when they both leaned on the porch rail. He said very quietly, "I have not been able to stop thinking about what you said about being afraid of softness. I should not have said it." "Why?" "Because it made me sound like someone who needs saving," she said, with an edge of her usual sharpness. "No," he said, equally quietly. "It made you sound like someone who knows herself." "That is not the same thing at all." He turned slightly toward her. "I have not wanted to stay anywhere in a long time," he said. "I want you to know that." She turned toward him too. They were very close in the dark. "You want me to know that specifically?" "Specifically," he said. She reached up and put her hand on his jaw, on the scar, gently, the way you touch something that has been hurt and healed, and he went very still, and then he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm with a gentleness that was at complete odds with everything else about him, and entirely consistent with what she was beginning to understand he actually was. "We are not done with the case," she said. "No," he said, "we are not. And you are about to deliver a prisoner to Santa Fe." "Yes. And I need to give testimony and work with a federal magistrate and arrange the legal challenge to the land title." All true. He was still holding her hand against his face. "I did say we would figure out the rest later." She laughed, suddenly, genuinely, the first real laugh she had produced in months, surprised out of her by the absurdity and the rightness of it simultaneously. "You did say that," she said. They arrived in Santa Fe the following afternoon, and the next 10 days were among the most intense and procedurally exhausting of Belle's already eventful recent months. The federal magistrate was a precise, skeptical man named Harrington, who asked very good questions and demanded very specific answers, and Belle found herself at her most focused and most articulate, understanding instinctively that this was the moment everything she had been working toward either solidified into something that could actually help her or dissolved back into the frustrating abstraction of injustice. Jonas was present for much of the proceedings, not as her advocate, since he was serving as the law officer who had made the arrest and assembled the evidence, but she was aware of him across the room during the testimony sessions, steady and precise, and his steadiness anchored her in a way she acknowledged to herself without fighting it. Billings came to Santa Fe voluntarily and gave his testimony with a completeness that suggested a man who had decided that partial honesty was no longer a viable mode. His wife had come with him, which Belle thought said something important. On the 7th day, federal charges were formally filed against Wade Coulter on 12 counts including land fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to defraud, and filing false instruments with a United States government land office. The magnitude of the charges surprised even Jonas's superiors, who had been expecting something significant but had not seen the full picture until all the documents were assembled in one place. On the 9th day, the federal magistrate issued a preliminary order voiding the land transfer of the Collins homestead on grounds of fraud pending the full trial, which meant that, while the title question would not be fully resolved until the trial concluded, the property could not be further transferred or developed, and Belle had legal standing to return to it. On the 10th day, Jonas found her sitting on a bench in the federal courthouse garden, holding the copy of the magistrate's order in both hands, looking at it. He sat beside her. "How are you?" he said. "I do not know yet." She looked up at him. "Is it always like this, after a long push towards something you needed," he said, "and then getting it? Yes. There is usually a period where you do not quite know what to do with your hands." "My father's land," she said. "I can go back to it." "You can. It is going to need considerable work. 3 months empty and then Coulter's people through it." She folded the order carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "I have been so focused on getting here that I have not thought much about what here actually means." "What does it mean?" She was quiet for a moment. "It means I have somewhere to be," she said. "For the first time in 6 months I have somewhere specific to be." She paused. "Where are you going next?" The question was careful, and he heard the weight under its surface, the real question she was asking, which was not logistical. He turned to face her on the bench, and this time there was no dark pass, no urgency of chase, no professional task requiring his attention as a reason to hold himself at a controlled distance. There was just morning light in a garden and Belle Collins looking at him with those direct, dark eyes. And the fact that he had thought about her with increasing specificity for the past 10 days in a way that was making his previously very organized internal life somewhat less organized. "My assignment in this district ends when Coulter is in federal custody awaiting trial," he said. "Which he now is." He paused. "I have 12 weeks of furlough accrued. I have not taken furlough in 4 years. 12 weeks, she said. "It is a significant amount of land work you are describing," he said. "Repairs, fencing, probably the well needs checking, the outbuildings. One person working alone would take several months at minimum." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was beginning to know, the one that contained both the sharp intelligence and the warmer thing underneath it, that she was less practiced at showing. "You are offering to come and fix my fence," she said. "Among other things," he said, and held her gaze steadily. She reached out and took his hand, the same hand she had held his face with on the third night's porch, and she held it between both of hers, not tentatively but with the same decisiveness she brought to everything. "Jonah," she said, "in the interest of honesty, which I gather is something you value." "I do. I am not an easy woman to share a life with. I have been told this by reliable sources." "The sources you have been describing to me all seem to have been looking for a woman who was easier to manage," he said. "I am not looking for that. What are you looking for?" He turned his hand over between hers and held them back. "I think I am looking at it," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, there on the garden bench in the Santa Fe courthouse square, with the morning sun coming in over the wall and birds making unreasonable amounts of noise in the trees. And he kissed her back with a warmth and a care that was exactly as she had known it would be, having known him for 10 days and somehow, in the particular way of people who have faced something terrifying together, considerably longer than that. They went to the Collins homestead together, riding out of Santa Fe in the first week of June with packed saddlebags and a list of materials arranged with the Santa Fe hardware merchant for delivery to Redrock in 2 weeks. The land was as she had feared and as she had hoped simultaneously. The main house was intact but had been gone through, drawers emptied, shelves disturbed, the particular violated quality of a place that has been searched. The barn needed a new roof on the south corner. 3 sections of fence along the east pasture were down. The well was fine. The cottonwood in the northeast corner was fine. Her father's grave beneath it was undisturbed, and she stood there for a long time the first afternoon, her hand on the rough wood of the marker, and Jonas stood a respectful distance behind her, and let her have the time she needed without making it about anything other than what it was. She came back to him eventually, and he did not say anything, just handed her a cup of water from the canteen, and that was exactly right. They worked. They worked hard, in the way of people who have both spent their lives doing physical work, and who know the specific satisfaction of a task completed by hand. Jonas was, as she had suspected from the evidence of his camp and his horse care, and his general competence with practical matters, an exceptionally skilled person at things that required both precision and endurance. He rebuilt the fence sections in less time than she had estimated. He mended the barn roof with an economy of motion and a refusal to take shortcuts that she found deeply satisfying to watch. He was methodical in the way she was, which meant they organized work naturally and without friction, each taking different aspects of the same project without needing to negotiate the division. He was also, she discovered in those June weeks, a person of considerably more warmth than his professional exterior suggested. He laughed at her jokes. He had opinions about cooking, well considered and not always correct but genuinely held, and he was capable of being argued out of them when she had better information, which she respected immensely in a man. He read in the evenings from a small collection of books he kept in his saddlebag, history mostly, and once she asked what he was reading and he read aloud to her for an hour, and the quality of his reading voice, measured and steady with the occasional inflection that revealed he was actually engaged with the material, was something she found unexpectedly affecting. He slept in the barn, which he had done since their arrival without discussion, on the grounds that there was no one else present to provide the social structure that would make the alternative unremarkable, and which Belle thought was both respectful and mildly exasperating given how clearly they both felt about each other by this point. About a week after their arrival, sitting on the porch steps in the evening after a long day of work, she said to him, "You are a very deliberate man. Is that a complaint?" He said, "It is an observation. You move carefully around things that matter to you." He thought about this. "Yes," he said. "I have learned not to rush things that deserve more than that." "I appreciate that," she said. "I also want you to know that I do not require an extended courtship of the Victorian variety. I know what I want and I have known for approximately 10 days. He turned to look at her. Even in the fading evening light she could see the quality of his attention, the way his careful face opened slightly when he looked at her. "Is that right?" he said. "That is right," she said. "I am telling you this explicitly because I suspect you might conduct yourself with exceptional propriety for several more weeks out of consideration for my feelings, and my feelings are that exceptional propriety, while admirable, is no longer what the moment calls for." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with that expression she loved without having said so yet, the one that was so much fuller and warmer than his controlled professional face, the one that was just him, just Jonas. "Belle," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard before, something that turned toward her completely. "Jonas," she said, "I am going to ask you something. Please do." "Will you marry me?" he said simply, directly, in the same voice he used for everything that was important. No performance, just the question. The word landed in her chest and opened there like something that had been waiting to bloom. "Yes," she said with the same directness. "Obviously, yes." He smiled then, a full, genuine smile that rearranged his whole face, and it was so unexpectedly beautiful that she laughed a little, surprised by it. And then he pulled her close and held her with the same quality of care that everything he did had, and she put her face against his neck and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, entirely safe. They were married in Raydrock 3 weeks later, in the small chapel on the north end of town, with Edmund Billings and his wife present, and Jonas's colleague, a marshal named Tate who had ridden up from Albuquerque specifically, and shook Jonas's hand with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this news for approximately 9 years. The preacher was a thin, earnest man who performed the ceremony with such genuine goodwill that Belle, who had intended to be composed and practical about the whole thing, found herself moved in a way that she decided in retrospect was entirely appropriate. Jonas said his vows in that same steady voice he used for everything important, looking at her the whole time with the full, open expression that was only for her, and she said hers back with the clarity and precision of a woman who means exactly what she says and knew it. Afterward, Mrs. Billings produced a cake she had apparently baked in secret, which was both unexpected and considerably better than the circumstances warranted. And they ate it on the church steps in the July sunlight while Tate told a long, meandering story about a previous Jonas Walden adventure in Colorado that ended with Jonas being rescued from a river by a mule, which Jonas confirmed was substantially accurate and declined to elaborate on. And Belle filed this information away with the particular delight of someone who has just acquired access to a very interesting archive. The summer passed in the way of summers on the land, long and physical and productive, the kind of days that tire the body and rest the mind. The Collins homestead came back to life in gradual and then sudden ways, the way recovering things do, slowly and then all at once. The barn was solid. The fences held. The garden her father had kept along the south wall of the house was replanted and growing. Belle cleared the room that had been her father's study and made it her own, spreading her documents and her correspondence there, because the legal work was not finished with Coulter's arrest. It would be months before the trial, and she was a witness and an interested party, and had no intention of being anything other than a fully prepared one. Jonas, in the meantime, had written to the United States Marshal's office with a request to be considered for the position of Marshal in the newly reorganized Redrock district, which had no current Marshal, and which the federal office was attempting to fill. The letter was precise and professional, and Jonas showed it to Belle before sending it, partly because he thought she should know and partly, she understood, because he was asking her what she thought without quite saying so. She read it, handed it back, and said, "Send it. This is where we live." He sent it. The appointment came back in September with a territorial judge's endorsement and a salary that was modest but sufficient and a jurisdiction covering 3 counties in the area. Jonas accepted it and was sworn in the following week in Redrock, pinning the star to the same coat he had been wearing when she first saw him on the ledge above the pass. And Belle stood in the small crowd outside the courthouse and watched him and felt something that was pride and love and a specific quality of rootedness, the sense of a life taking actual shape in actual ground. The Coulter trial took place in the Federal District Court in Santa Fe in October of 1882 and lasted 9 days. Belle testified for 3 of them, clearly and completely and without embellishment, because she did not need embellishment. The facts were sufficient. Billings testified as well, and his cooperation, combined with Jonas's assembled evidence and Belle's recovered documents, produced a case that the defense had very little room to work against. Wade Coulter was found guilty on 9 of 12 counts and sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary. The remaining 3 counts were dismissed on technical grounds, which the prosecutor called a partial win and Belle called a complete one, because the 9 convictions included the land fraud and the forgery, which was the essential thing. More importantly, the Collins homestead title was restored to Belle Collins Walden by federal court order in November, with a finding that the original transfer had been executed by fraud and was therefore void from its inception. Her father's land was hers, legally, completely, beyond any further challenge. She rode back out to the homestead from Santa Fe with Jonas beside her on a cold November day with the cottonwoods in the arroyo gone yellow, and the sky that particular shade of New Mexico blue that exists in no other latitude. And when she saw the house from the road, smoke coming from the chimney because Jonas had ridden ahead that morning and started the fire, her eyes filled in a way she did not try to prevent. "It is yours," Jonas said beside her. "It is ours," she said. The winter was quiet and cold, and deeply happy in the way that is specific to people who have been through considerable difficulty, and emerged from it with something real. They were good company for each other, which she had not taken for granted as a certainty even after knowing she loved him, because love and good company are not always the same thing. They were both readers, both early risers, both inclined toward directness over diplomacy in private conversation. They argued sometimes, actual arguments with actual stakes, about decisions regarding the land or about Jonas's work schedule, or about the occasionally alarming ratio of risk to necessity in his approach to certain law enforcement situations. These arguments tended to be productive, ending not in one person winning, but in the recognition of the specific valid thing each of them had been saying, which Belle considered a very good sign about a marriage. She also discovered, over the winter, that Jonas Walden was the kind of man who did small things with great intention. He kept her coffee hot. He remembered without being told what she was working on and asked specific questions about it. When she was tired and did not want to talk, he did not need to fill the silence. When she woke in the night from the occasional nightmare, he was simply awake as well, and he would hold her with the complete steadiness that was his particular quality, and she would feel the nightmare dissolving back into the dark where it came from. In March of 1883, she told him she was pregnant. He received this information with a stillness that lasted about 4 seconds, and then his face did something she had only seen it do a few times, opened completely, all the controlled professional containment gone, just Jonas, just the full extent of how he felt, which was clearly considerable. He crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms and held her there for a long time without saying anything, and she felt him breathing and felt the quality of the held breath and the released breath, and it was one of the most intimate moments of her life. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise fine." "We will need to," he stopped, visibly cataloging approximately 15 practical things simultaneously. "Jonas," she said, "we have time." "Right," he said. He pulled back and looked at her face with that look that was entirely his and entirely hers. "I am very happy," he said simply. "I know," she said. "I can see that." Their son was born in October of 1883 in the Collins homestead, delivered by the midwife from Redrock on a clear autumn morning. Jonas was present for the whole of it, having stated in advance that he had no intention of being anywhere else, and his presence, which Belle had been uncertain about wanting and then was deeply glad of, was exactly what his presence always was: steady, capable, attentive, completely reliable. They named him Thomas, after her father. Jonas had suggested it, which meant more to her than she had words for. Thomas Walden was an opinionated and energetic child almost from his first breath, and by the time he was 3 months old had developed strong views about sleeping arrangements, meal times, and the appropriate level of ambient noise in his vicinity. Views he communicated with impressive volume for such a small person. Jonas, who had no prior experience with infants, adapted to fatherhood with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, learning quickly, and without pride, the various arts of soothing and feeding, and managing a small human who was not yet accessible to reason. Belle watched him with their son, and felt something settle into place in her that she had not known was unsettled. The Redrock of 1883 and 1884 was changing in the way of western towns that found themselves on the right side of railroad expansion. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line had reached the area, bringing with it a wave of new settlers, new commerce, and new complications for a territorial marshal whose district now included a growing town with a growing population, and the associated expansion of every kind of human difficulty. Jonas was busy. His work was never finished, but it was legitimate work, work that meant something, and he did it with the combination of firmness and fairness that was becoming something of a reputation for him in the district. He came home every evening, which was not something all men in his profession could say. He came home because there was a reason to come home that he had not had for 9 years, and he understood the value of that with the full weight of a man who knew what its absence felt like. In the spring of 1885, Belle discovered something that she had been preparing to discover for some time. In going through the last of the stored documents from her father's desk, documents she had been slowly and carefully cataloging as part of her effort to fully restore the homestead's legal records. She found a small journal her father had kept intermittently over the last 2 years of his life. In that journal, she found 3 entries that described her father's growing awareness of what Coulter was doing, his attempts to organize the neighboring homesteaders against the land grab, and his plans to contact the federal land office in Washington directly if the county response proved inadequate. She also found in the last entry, dated 12 days before his death, a single sentence that she had to read several times. "I believe I am being followed. I am writing this down in case something happens. My name is Thomas Collins. I am not afraid." She sat with that for a long time. Jonas found her in the study that evening, the journal in her lap. He sat across from her and waited. "He knew," she said. "He knew something was coming and he was not afraid." "No," Jonas said. "He was not." "I have been angry for almost 3 years," she said, "about what was done to him, and I have had justice for most of it legally. Everything that could be done was done." "Yes," he said. "But I think," she said slowly, "that what I needed was this. To know that he was not a victim who did not see it coming. He was a man who saw it clearly and chose to stand anyway." She looked up at Jonas. "That is who he was." "Yes," Jonas said. "That is who he was." He paused. "That is also who his daughter is." She put the journal on the desk beside her. She looked at Jonas across the lamplight room, at this man who had ridden into a dark past to help a stranger, who had built her fences and shared her grief and given her a son named Thomas and come home every evening for 2 years. This man whose careful, warm, deliberately offered heart she held as the most valuable thing she had ever been trusted with. "Jonas," she said. "Belle," he said. "Thank you," she said, and she meant every dimension of it, all the ways and all the things, and she knew he heard all of it. "Thank you," he said back, and he meant it the same way. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1886, 3 years after Thomas. She was a small, fierce infant with dark hair, and as she grew toward toddlerhood, Jonas's watchful quality and Belle's sharp impatience, and a combination of the two that suggested she was going to give them both considerable exercise in coming years. They named her Ruth, after Jonas's first wife, which was Belle's suggestion, made one quiet evening with a directness and a kindness that had Jonas unable to speak for a full minute. He had thanked her for that too, in the way of a man for whom gratitude is not a small currency. Thomas, at 3, was deeply uncertain about the new arrival for approximately 2 weeks, and then became her fiercest champion, which was entirely on brand for a child who had his mother's decisiveness and his father's absolute commitment once he had made up his mind. In 1887, 5 years after Belle had stood at Cannon Pass with nowhere left to run, she sat on the porch of the Collins homestead in the September evening and watched Jonas come in from the south pasture with Thomas on his shoulders, the boy gesturing extensively about something, Jonas listening with complete attention and occasional comment. The mountains were turning purple in the last light. The cottonwoods along the dry wash were gold. Ruth was asleep inside, as evidenced by the absence of her opinions from the general soundscape. Belle held a cup of coffee and watched her family come toward her across the land that was hers, that was theirs, that had been fought for and won, and built into something real. She thought about the girl who had stood at the edge of the pass in the dark with her back against a canyon wall and 3 armed men below her, and thought that was the end of the story. She thought about a man on a gray horse who had come out of the dark and said, "Get on my horse," in that voice that was like a foundation being laid. And she thought about the rope tossed down without drama and the climb and the long night's ride and 4 days on the road and 10 days in Santa Fe, and a marriage on church steps, and a son named Thomas and a daughter named Ruth, and every single morning in between. She thought about what her father had written in the last entry of his journal. "I am not afraid." She had not been afraid. Not ultimately, not at the center of it, even when fear was the appropriate response to the immediate circumstances. She had been afraid of softness once, of the particular vulnerability of wanting things. She was not afraid of that anymore. She had learned, in the specific school of Jonas Walden's company, that softness was not fragility. That wanting things was not weakness. That love, chosen deliberately by people who had both survived enough to know what they were choosing, was the most resistant thing she had ever encountered. Jonas lifted Thomas off his shoulders as they reached the porch, set him down with the easy strength that was completely natural to him, and Thomas immediately announced that he had found what he believed to be a coyote track near the south fence and needed to discuss it at length. "After supper," Jonas told him. "But after supper," Jonas said, in the voice that was gentle and completely non-negotiable, and Thomas accepted this in the philosophical spirit of a child who has learned which battles are worth having. Jonas came up the steps and sat beside Belle and reached over and took her hand, his large calloused hand around hers, the gesture so habitual now that it had its own language, its own specific weight. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. "I had a letter from the Federal Land Office. The final title certification came through, every document, every parcel fully clear." "Good," he said. "Completely done," she said. "Every piece of it finished." She felt him press her hand slightly in acknowledgement of what that meant, which was everything, which was the last piece settling into its place after 5 years of effort, the full and complete restoration of what had been taken. Thomas was in the yard loudly explaining coyote tracks to a completely uninterested barn cat. Inside the house, Ruth would sleep for perhaps another 45 minutes before she woke with views about the world that she felt needed to be heard. The mountains held the last light. The land stretched out in every direction. Her father's land, their land, good land that knew the names of the people who worked it. Belle Collins Walden sat on her porch with her hand in her husband's hand, and the whole of an earned life arranged around her. And she was not afraid of any of it. Not the softness of it, not the vulnerability of it, not the breathtaking full-hearted risk of loving people this completely in a world this capable of loss. She had learned that from Jonas, who had lost and come back from it, and ridden into a dark past to help a stranger and stayed. She had learned it from her father, who had seen clearly and chosen to stand anyway. She had learned it from herself, from the girl who had climbed a rope with 3 men watching and figured out the rest later. "Jonas," she said. He said, "I need you to know something." He turned to look at her, that full and quiet attention. "Every good thing in the last 5 years," she said, "every single day, I would go back and climb that rope again." He looked at her for a long moment, and the last light of the mountain evening was in his eyes, gray-green and steady and warm, and his face had that expression that was only ever for her, open and certain and entirely at home. "So would I," he said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it, the same gesture he had made on a relay station porch in the dark when they were both still learning what the other one was, and it meant the same thing it had meant then and more, always more. Because that was what time and shared life did to the things that were true. It made them truer. Inside the house, Ruth woke up and began expressing her views on the evening. Thomas abandoned the barn cat and came running up the porch steps. Jonas stood and swung his son up by one arm, and Belle watched them. And the night came down over the mountains and the cottonwoods and the grave in the northeast corner, and the fences that held and the home that stood. And it was all, every piece of it, exactly what it was supposed to be.